everyone, and welcome to our thematic webinar dedicated to the food and agriculture sector. We're just going to wait a few more minutes to let everyone join us for this webinar. So thank you all for being with us today. So I can see we have a few more participants coming. Really slightly stopped. Maybe if we go to the next slide, I can quickly explain a few rules during the webinar today. So you will not be able to speak during the webinar. You have the possibility to ask questions at a moment during the webinar. We will share with you the link to raise your questions. If you have any technical issue, you can always put us a small message also in the chat. And if you want, you can rename yourself in Zoom so that we know who is connected with us also today. So maybe a few words of introduction also for beginning this webinar. And before talking about the food and agriculture sector, which is the topic of the webinar, let's take a step back. You can go, and just remind ourselves also of why biodiversity matters. Because as you may all know, biodiversity is declining at an unprecedented rate. But biodiversity is vital for humans, and notably because of the many services it provides, which are the ecosystem services, such as the quality of air and water, climate regulation, quality of soil, and pollination. And just by giving you these examples, we can see that it's quite clear that many of these services are key for the production of food and for agriculture. And this is what we will also focus on today during the webinar, as we will see that agriculture is a sector that is intrinsically linked to biodiversity. Besides the link between biodiversity and the food and agriculture sector, if we just look at a few key figures for the sector, we can very quickly grasp the importance of the sector. In terms of the land occupation, for example, 4.74 billion hectares are occupied for farmland. Also in terms of economic revenue, in 2011, the agricultural sector represented 3.2 billion euro of turnover, while the food sector represented 4.2 billion euro of turnover. And also in terms of production, for example, in 2021, the agricultural production represented 9.5 billion of tons. And many companies are also concerned by this sector, either directly or throughout their value chain. And if we look at the NA 100 list, for example, 31 companies out of 91 are included in the agricultural sector, showing the needs of this sector to also address the biodiversity crisis. And so, as I said, agriculture is a sector greatly interdependent on biodiversity, and notably because it's the most impactful sector on biodiversity, as we will also see a bit more into detail later during the webinar. And just to give you a glimpse, the sector exerts several pressures on biodiversity. The most material one is land use change because of land occupation and conversion of natural lands into agricultural land. But all the other pressures on biodiversity are also material for the agriculture sector. Would it be exploitation of resources, climate change, pollution, or invasive alien species? In addition to impact on the food and agriculture sector, this sector is highly depending on ecosystem services, as you can see on this slide. We will deep dive into this figure later on, but just to give you also a hint, all industries or in the food and agriculture sector are very dependent on the availability of surface and groundwater resources. The most dependent industries is related to crop cultivation, and also many industries rely on the flood and storm protection ecosystem services. So maybe to go through quickly the agenda for this webinar, considering the importance of the sector in the economy, but also its strong interdependence on biodiversity, we have decided this year in the B4B Plus Club, but more generally at CDC Biodiversity, to focus our work stream on this sector. And the objective of the webinar today is to give you a bit an overview of the work we're doing on this sector. So we'll first present the B4B Plus Club and the specific focus on food and agriculture we're working on. Then we will give you an idea of the high quality content you can access as a club member by presenting the results of our newly updated benchmark fact sheets and giving you an exclusive preview also of the publication we're working on risks related to the sector that we jointly presented with the World Benchmarking Alliance. And we have today with us Michael Lee also, who will present the work he conducted with us. And lastly, we will present a tailor-made training we're working on dedicated to the sector. But so let's continue with our presentation, and we will start by giving you a small introduction to the B4B Plus Club. You can go to the next slide. So the B4B Plus Club is a network of over 50 companies, financial institutions, and consultants. And by being part of this global ecosystem, you can be part of an ecosystem of actors who are committed and motivated by footprint assessments and actors who are willing to share the challenges related to biodiversity footprinting, how to integrate this in their biodiversity strategy, and also how this can help them meet regulations and reporting requirements. You have on the next slide an overview of the club members. So you can go to the next slide. And so this is something you can also find on our website, but this gives you an idea of the members who, as I said, are either companies, financial institutions, or consultants, and who represent all the sectors of the economy. Moving to the next slide, we can give you an idea of how the work in the B4B Plus Club is organized. We work through working groups. We have three stakeholder-based working groups, one for consultants, one for financial institutions, and one for companies dedicated to the challenges in their value chain. We have also a team-based working group, one related to biodiversity credits and one related to food and agriculture. We will focus on this one a bit later on. And we also have an international working group for non-French speaking members. And so all the club members have access to several of these working groups per year, but also one plenary event mixing all the types of members in the club. And we also organize ad hoc events in the form of dedicated webinars. Moving to the next slide, we can also explain a bit the wide range of services you can have access to as a club member. First, you have access to regular newsletter, where we analyze the latest reports related to biodiversity footprinting and also regulatory developments. The B4B Plus Club also acts as an innovation hub, and we develop within, so we can click on, we also develop, so several times, one more. We also develop case studies to contribute to innovative discussions and contribute to new methodological developments to better compute impacts and dependencies on biodiversity. During our events, we have also intervention of experts to also highlight specific viewpoints from key initiatives in the sector. As a club member, you also have access to a license to our biodiversity footprinting tool, which is the Global Biodiversity Score, the GBS, and you also have privileged access to our training courses. And we will tell you a bit more about one of them later on. And you can also have access to technical support to assist you in using the GBS, but not only. If you have specific questions related to your biodiversity strategy or regulatory frameworks, this is also a service you can use as a club member. So if we move to the next slide, just to give you an idea, so the B4B Plus Club is, you can join the B4B Plus Club by paying as well an annual fee. You have here the prices of the club, which depend also on the size of your company. And so we would be very happy if some of you would like to join us in the discussion we have in the B4B Plus Club, and in particular the discussion we have on a specific working group we have developed related to the food and agriculture sector. And I give the floor to Antonin to tell you a bit more about this group.
Thank you, Claire. So as we said in the introduction, the agriculture sector is very important for the preservation of ecosystems, but also for many companies in their value chain. So this is why with the B4B Plus Club, we decided to launch a working group dedicated to this sector with 4 sessions over the year 2025, during which we will try to contribute to innovate in terms of biodiversity footprint assessment in this sector by exploring the specific methodologies and by sharing the best practices. So the first session took place at the end of January. It was an introductory session during which we presented information at the sector level, so very macro information about the main impacts, dependencies, and risks related to biodiversity in the food and agriculture sector. So the work we presented in detail during this working group will be presented just after in this webinar in a much shorter form, but it will give you an idea of the kind of content you can access by joining the B4B Plus Club. The next working group in June will look in more detail at farming practices and their different impacts on biodiversity, taking the example of organic farming, regenerative agriculture, etc. There will also be a presentation by Margot Durand, who is currently working on her PhD at CDC Biodiversité. She will present her meta-analysis of the impacts of diversified agricultural practices, depending on whether or not pesticides are used, the type of crops grown, the presence or absence of hedgerows, etc. And finally, during the second working group in June, we will present the initial results and trends of the biodiversity footprinting for the agricultural transition project, on which we are collaborating with ICARE. So it's a project which aims to bridge the gap between the action of farmers and the impact metrics used by companies and financial institutions for reporting and piloting. So that's for the second working group. For the third one in October, we will focus on the existing metrics and tools for measuring impacts on biodiversity. So which metrics and scales are relevant in different cases, which existing tools are relevant, depending on the crops to be studied, the place in the value chain, etc. And to summarize this information, we plan to make a benchmark of existing tools and how they complement each other. With focus in the discussion on the complementarity of 2 tools developed by CDC Biodiversité. So the Global Biodiversity Score, which is a more global measurement tool designed to measure impacts on biodiversity throughout the value chain, and AgriBest, which is a much more local tool designed for farmers to help them understand and assess the impacts and dependencies of their practices on biodiversity. With the idea that to measure precisely and exhaustively impacts on biodiversity, we need this different type of tools. So finally, the last working group will be a summary of the recommendations for the food and agriculture sector. We'll share the best practices and lessons learned specific to this sector, and we will look at other issues that are particularly important for biodiversity assessment in this sector, such as water consumption, ecotoxicity, soil biodiversity, etc. So as you can see, during the B4B Plus Club working groups, you have a real opportunity to access high quality content, innovative initiatives, and valuable feedback. And during this webinar, we are going to present 2 of these very interesting projects. So our publication on biodiversity related risks done in collaboration with the World Benchmarking Alliance, and our benchmark fact sheet on the main impacts and dependencies of the agriculture sector. And I give the floor to Blanche to present this first important work.
Thank you very much, Antonin. So as he introduced, during the next 15 minutes, we will focus on presenting some results on one of the works carried out by the club, which is the Food and Agriculture Benchmark Fact Sheet, a document which evaluates the sector's contribution to biodiversity loss and its critical dependencies on ecosystems. This presentation is part of CDC Biodiversité's update of the results concerning the contribution of the food and agricultural sector to biodiversity loss. And as you may know, documents specific to this sector are already available on CDC Biodiversité's website. There is a benchmark fact sheet, the document on the left of this slide, and its sectoral appendix. However, these documents were published in 2021, and since then the GPS tool has undergone major updates, and the information contained in this document was no longer entirely accurate or up to date. So the results that will be presented today are the results of work carried out by the club with the aim of improving the accuracy and clarity of the sectoral documents available and to fill in the gaps in the appendix which previously lacked detail. Both these documents are accessible in a draft version, and their final version will be published in the next few months. So during all this presentation, please keep in mind that the results were not obtained from company-specific data, but based on financial turnover data. So let's start by setting the stage and defining the scope of this very large sector. This figure presents the value chain of the food and agricultural sector. It is composed by two subsectors. The first one is the agricultural sector, corresponding to the crop and animal production orange box. It includes both plant production, so cereals, vegetable, fruits, and animal production. But this sector also includes non-food products, such as commodities most likely to be used in the textile sector, such as the production of wool, silk, or cotton. The second subsector is the food sector, corresponding to the two other orange boxes, which are manufacturing of food products and manufacture of beverages. And it includes everything related to food processing, such as beverages, meats, dairy, oils, or sugar processing. These two subsectors are highly interconnected through their respective value chains, as agriculture is an upstream activity for the food sector, as it supplies the raw material essential for food and beverage production. And quite logically, the food sector can be a downstream activity for agriculture when agricultural products are processed into manufactured products. Also, the crop and animal production industry supplies itself as crops are necessary for animal feed. So now that the scope of the sector has been settled, and before going further in the presentation of the sector's impact on biodiversity, a quick explanation of how results were obtained in this presentation. The GBS tool, the Global Biodiversity Score tool, is a biodiversity footprint tool developed by CDC Biodiversité, as Antonin introduced, and one of its goals is to measure impact of companies and sectors on biodiversity. A key concept to understand the result that will be presented during this webinar is the metric used in the GBS, because just like distance can be measured in meters, the impacts on biodiversity are expressed with a metric, the mean species abundance, and this metric represents ecosystem health and condition on a scale from 0 for a completely degraded area to 100% for a pristine one. And in the GBS, for a given area, the value obtained in MSA is multiplied by the impacted surface, and at the end is obtained an impact in MSA square kilometers. And this metric is very easy to understand, as an impact of one MSA square kilometer is equivalent to the destruction of 1 square kilometer of undisturbed natural ecosystem. To give an example, if we transform 10 square kilometers of natural grassland with 100% MSA into grassland moderately used for grazing, which corresponds to an MSA of 70%, this corresponds to a loss of 30% of MSA over 10 square kilometers, so an impact of 3 MSA square kilometers. So now that we have in mind the general functioning of the GBS tool and the metric used, the following slides will present the main results regarding food and agriculture's impact on biodiversity. The sector's impact on biodiversity are substantial as its direct activities, so its scope 1 are responsible for 73% of accumulated negative impacts on terrestrial biodiversity over time. Indeed, its scope 1 terrestrial static impacts reach 28 million MSA square kilometers, which correspond to the destruction of terrestrial biodiversity over time on a land area slightly larger than the combined land surface of United States and the South America. And in addition to this sector has the greatest contribution to the additional loss of terrestrial biodiversity, as its annually impacts are responsible for the loss of terrestrial biodiversity over a land area equivalent to Cuba. These information are particularly striking given that the sector represents only 7% of global turnover, highlighting a disproportionate relationship between its economic contribution and its environmental consequences. Please, in the rest of the presentation, keep in mind that in this slide, we will only focus on the sector's accumulated negative impacts on terrestrial biodiversity, because due to time constraints, we won't be able to explore all the results. So the impact presented in the previous slide was an absolute impact on biodiversity in MSA square kilometers, but absolute impacts can be converted into impact intensities, which unit is MSA square meter per kilo euro. So to obtain impact intensities, the absolute impacts are divided by the turnover of the whole sector or by the turnover of its industries. And why do we use this unit? This unit allows a comparison between industries of different sizes. It allows companies to compare themselves with benchmark values, and it allows us to compare the sector's impact on biodiversity to the impact compatible with planetary boundaries. So in the rest of the presentation, the sector's impact on biodiversity will be presented as impact intensities. To introduce the rest of the presentation and how we present impact intensities for sectors and industries, let me give a bit of context of the traffic light graphs that we use and how we use them. So as you may know, the Global Biodiversity Framework has set 4 long-term goals to be achieved by 2050, and one of its goals is the protection and restoration of biodiversity on its 3 components, which are ecosystems, species, and genetic diversity. And if this goal is transposed to a more generic scale, as represented on this graph, this amounts to developing a scenario aimed at bending the curve of our society's impact on biodiversity by achieving a no net loss of biodiversity by 2030, and then to achieve biodiversity gains by 2050. On this graph, the planetary biodiversity boundary is translated in MSA, and it is estimated as a remaining biodiversity of 72% MSA. So we can see that with the remaining biodiversity above 72%, so corresponding to the green area, we are in a safe operating space, and below that, we are in a zone of uncertainty with higher risks of disturbance. And at CDC Biodiversité, to position the performance of sectors and companies on this trajectory, we use traffic light graphs. So here, WP corresponds to the global terrestrial static impact intensity compatible with planetary boundaries. So in an easier way to understand it, This means this represents the accumulated negative impacts on terrestrial biodiversity over time that will be compatible with planetary boundaries. So if each economic player had a static impact intensity of 320 MSA square meter per kilo euro or less, corresponding to the green part of the traffic light graph, we would be compatible with planetary boundaries. The orange part of the graph is reached when sectors are above this boundary, and sectors that reach the red zone are among those that have the greatest impacts. So now let's look at food and agriculture's impact on biodiversity more specifically. Starting with the agricultural sector, this graph shows that scope 1 of this sector, meaning its direct activities, have an impact on terrestrial biodiversity well above the intensity compatible with planetary boundaries. However, we should keep in mind that the agricultural sector is intrinsically dependent on biodiversity, as we showed in the introduction, and it has a significant impact on it. And it seems rather unrealistic to imagine this sector as being below the planetary boundaries. So today, the objective for stakeholders in the sector is to reduce their impacts on biodiversity and get as close as possible to this limit. But if we really want to respect the planetary boundaries regarding biodiversity, efforts should be allocated between the different sectors. Now, regarding the food sector's static impacts on terrestrial biodiversity, its direct activities are clearly lower and, on average, compatible with planetary boundaries. However, if we consider its entire value chain, the sector is well above the intensity compatible with global limits, and this is mainly due to agricultural activities within its value chain. So here were presented the general impacts on biodiversity of both agriculture and food subsectors, but let's look more closely to the impacts of industries included in the sector. So in this slide are presented the sector's static impacts on terrestrial biodiversity. This corresponds to the accumulated negative impact the sector had on terrestrial biodiversity over time. Results here are broken down by scope and industry, and it is important to keep in mind that for a given industry, both its direct and upstream activities are considered here. This graph shows that depending on the industry, impacts are not attributed to the same scope, and for the crop and animal production industries, Scope 1 activities appear to be the primary contributors, and this is largely due to the strong impact on biodiversity of crop cultivation and livestock husbandry through grazing. Greenhouse gas also contribute to the Scope 1 impacts, mainly for industries associated with animal production through their methane and CO2 emissions. This group of industry also has impacting upstream activities, and it is mainly the case for livestock husbandry activities such as cattle farming and raw milk industries. And this is because these industries require crops for animal feed produced by their upstream industries. On the other hand, the manufacturing industries have almost all their terrestrial static impacts attributed to their upstream activities, and this pattern aligns with the structure of the food and agricultural value chain, where beverage and food manufacturing industries heavily depend on agricultural raw materials. And to further understand the nature of the impact that I just presented, this graph breaks down the terrestrial static results, but by pressure this time. The terrestrial static impacts of all industries is led by spatial pressures, which include land use, fragmentation, and encroachment. But land use is the most significant of these pressures due to the large areas required for crop and livestock production. And indeed, the results using the GBS tool has showed that almost 3/4 of the terrestrial static impacts of crop and animal production can be attributed to land use. Following these spatial pressures, climate change emerges as the second major driver, primarily due to greenhouse gas emissions throughout the value chain. Now, if we want to move a bit backward, and if we want to compare the impacts on biodiversity of the different industries, these figures clearly reveal significant disparity within the sector. A particularly high impact intensity is observed for cattle-related activities because of the large areas required for animal feed, but above all for grazing, which is responsible for 95% of the terrestrial static impact of cattle farming's direct activities. The next most impacting industries are crop production industries, as they require large areas of land, followed by less impacting animal production industries such as pig or poultry farming. So all the results that I just presented during this webinar were obtained by CDC Biodiversité using the Global Biodiversity Score tool, but the sectoral study will be supplemented by 2 qualitative surveys. The first one will focus on biodiversity labels and certifications, and it will provide an overview of various organic farming labels, highlighting the difference in their requirements for biodiversity preservation. This focus will also examine and assess other commodity-specific labels to evaluate how effectively they incorporate and promote biodiversity preservation into their standards. The second focus will look at regenerative agriculture, a concept we are hearing more and more about, to explain what it is, its benefits, and its limitations. Thank you very much for your listening on this part, and I will now lead to Emma, who will be presenting.
It's just, if you have any questions during the webinar, you can put them on Menti. You have here the code. We will take all the questions at the end of the webinar.
Yes, so maybe now we can lead to Emma.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Emma Godefroy, and I'm project officer at CDC Biodiversité, and had the opportunity to contribute to the publication we are presenting today. So this publication provides a methodology and resources to assess the biodiversity-related risks in the food and agriculture sector, and was written in collaboration with the World Benchmarking Alliance, and we're very happy to have Michael Lee with us today. So without waiting, I will give him the floor so he can introduce the World Benchmarking Alliance and their work in this publication.
So the World Benchmarking Alliance is an NGO based in the Netherlands, and we're aimed at benchmarking the sustainability performance of the top 2,000 companies worldwide. We've divided companies into what we call the 7 transformations, and each transformation contains 1 or more benchmarks, each with their own sector-specific methodologies. This is perfect timing. You can see on the left the 7 transformations model. I think we're currently in presentation mode, and we might have to be in display mode, but that's okay. And on the right, you see the nature benchmark graph. The data I have here today is drawn from research made in 2023, where we assessed 350 food and agriculture companies in their nature and food benchmarks on many of the topics that's already been mentioned. And here I have some specific data points that's also referenced in our key finding report and also in the joint publication that we will release soon. So if I can draw your attention to these data points, especially to the ones on the left. So we consider nature in quite a holistic way. We consider the governance of each company, the managing strategy. And in this measurement area, we find that only 8% of the 350 assessed companies have group-wide targets on all their key material topics that they have defined. And moreover, only 2% comprehensively assess its impacts, including the connection between nature and people, which could include things like the societies or communities that the companies impact through their work. And we believe this is an opportunity for companies to better demonstrate their leadership in setting strong sustainability strategies at the corporate level. The data points on the right, we also see quite a lacking performance overall in terms of ecosystem conversion. Only 13% of the companies have made a commitment towards zero ecosystem conversion, and only 6% have had a time-bound target to eliminate deforestation, which is obviously a very important target in the context of food and agriculture companies. These results reveal overall concerningly low levels of disclosure, efforts to avoid and minimize conversion, and this is consistent across different regions and industry segments. And our ask and our key finding is that companies take immediate tangible action to develop more sustainable and ethical supply chains. These information are drawn from our key findings, which can be seen on the website. I can maybe put the link in the chat later or ask our host to. We are currently in the process of repeating the assessment for 750 companies, with a new methodology which will be released next year. Our results are free and publicly available scorecards, which is again available on the website. I think this is over to my co-host. So
yeah, thank you very much, Michael,
yes,
and sorry for the technical issue. So yeah, you just presented it. When it comes to managing biodiversity risks, companies of the agriculture and food sector often fall short. So the objective of this publication was to provide a roadmap with initial no regret action to address these risks. So it's designed for corporation, financial institutions, public authorities. And the approach starts with impact and dependencies assessment. So Blanche presented it earlier, so I won't get into it, but this step helps identify key risk areas and high priority subsectors. And when we talk about impact, we also consider high impact commodities. So this initial steps allows to identify the most at-risk sectors, so those with high dependencies, those with significant biodiversity impact or high-risk commodities. And then we move from assessing impact and dependencies to identify risks and then prioritize them. So this enables to have target actions to mitigate the most critical risks. So given the limited time that we have today, I won't be able to cover the entire publication and all the resources offered. So the goal is more to give you an overview of some resources that are available to identify the high-risk commodity. Then I briefly explain how risk can be identified, and finally conclude with an example of the scoring of risk framework that are presented in the publication in action. So first, let's start with the results that are presented on high-risk commodities. So the figure presented here explores the terrestrial static impact of nearly 50 commodities. So this figure includes an horizontal axis with the absolute impact in MSA square kilometer of each crop types. So this axis allows to identify which crop had the most impact on biodiversity at global level. And you also have a vertical axis with the impact intensity in MSA square kilometer per ton of product. And this axis allows for a better comparison between different crop types without taking into account the total quantity that is produced. So commodity with high impact or commodities with high intensity may be more susceptible to be target of regulation or changes in consumer demand. And finally, in these figures, the last element is the size of the bubble, which is proportional to the quantity produced. And so this aspect allows to identify the most produced crops worldwide. And we see that it's the 4 crops that are presented on the right of the graph, so soybeans, wheat, rice, and maize. So at global level, those 4 crops account for 50% of the terrestrial static impact caused by cropland cultivation. And so if we try to convert this impact with an analogy, we have the equivalent to the destruction of natural ecosystem across the size of Australia. So this finding highlights the critical importance of incorporating common crops, soybeans, wheat, rice, maize, into agri-funds company biodiversity strategy. This graph also highlights other crops on the top left side, crops like nuts, coffee, cocoa, which they have a low absolute impact because they are on the left on the graph, but have also high impact intensities. So they must be the subject to some kind of other strategy. And maybe one of the most surprising findings in this figure is the relatively low impact intensity of several intensive monoculture crops, such as oil palm, sugarcane, banana, and coconut. So those crops are characterized by intensive agricultural system, so with high yields, and then an important productivity. So this important productivity leads to low impact intensities. So that's the point here, is to say that the impact on ecosystem condition that is presented here, what that is measured with the global biodiversity score, is not the only aspect to be considered. And for those types of crops, so oil palm, sugarcane, banana, and coconut, the concern is mainly due to the interaction of these crops with area of high biodiversity significance. So it leads us to the next slide. And the example of palm oil illustrates the importance of considering both impact but also locations when we try to assess the risks associated with crop cultivation. So this second figure highlights the 3 countries most affected by the cultivation of 5 different key commodities, so maize, wheat, rice, soybeans, and alpine fruits. And for instance, you have 3 countries, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Nigeria. Together, they concentrate more than 80% of the static impacts for oil palm cultivation. So so in addition to the concentrated impacts on a few numbers of countries, for oil palm, for example, the biodiversity significance of these countries also exacerbate the risks, because many of them are home to ecosystem with high ecological integrity. For example, China, Russia, and the United States each have over 20% of the land that is covered by high integrity ecosystems. You also have Brazil that is protecting over 30% of its territory. So after this presentation and the few results on the high-risk commodity that must be integrated into the strategy, we can move on and go back to what the publication provides initially, a framework to evaluate the risks, and it starts by the identification of the risks. Just briefly, when we talk about biodiversity-related risks, we distinguish between 2 main types of risks, transition risk and physical risks. So I'll focus only on physical risk, but just so you know, the publication also covers the transition risk. By physical risks, we refer to all the economic costs and all the financial losses that result from the nature degradation and the loss of ecosystem services that all the businesses and the agriculture and the food sector depend on. So as mentioned earlier in the webinar, as an introduction, the food and agriculture sector relies heavily on all ecosystem services, which make it vulnerable to physical risks. So it's possible to analyze how an activity depend on specific ecosystem services. It's possible to understand how the physical risk could arise, because if the ecosystem services and an activity depend on disrupted, it will lead to physical risks. And the publication includes a list of key physical risks tied to ecosystem services disruption. For example, the collapse of ecosystem services, soil and sediment retention can lead to the risk of soil erosion and will lead to lower agricultural productivity and so on. And so we worked on providing risk description for all the ecosystem services, the 21 ecosystem services. And the last step when we want to work on risks, once they've been identified, the idea is to prioritize them, to focus efforts on those with the highest potential impact. For this, we presented the framework provided by the TNFD. because it offers a systematic methodology to evaluate risks that relate to biodiversity. And in this framework, the risk evaluation is split into two components and two critical dimensions that have to be evaluated, magnitude and likelihood. So first, the magnitude of a risk refers to the potential consequences if a risk arises. And so this dimension helps to assess the scale of damage. So when it comes to physical risks, this magnitude can be evaluated with the dependency score. The greater the dependency on ecosystem services, the greater the impact if those services are degraded. So the dependency score are used as a proxy to evaluate the magnitude. And then the second aspect is the likelihood. It looks at how probable it is that the risk will occur. So this depends on factors like the stability of local ecosystem, how resilient the ecosystem are in a given area and in the surrounding ecosystem of the activity. And the final risk cross those two dimensions, likelihood and magnitude. So you can see on the matrix that is presented on the slide. Based assessing those two aspects, we have a final scoring for the risk. I will finish by taking an example and see how this evaluation framework can be applied in practice. So yeah, we can take two examples. And so the magnitude is assessed by looking at the dependency score, and the likelihood on the other end is assessed depending on factors like the geographic location of the activity, the specific characteristic of it, the mitigation strategy that the company could put in place to reduce the risk. So for example, in the case of the first risk, aquifer depletion and irrigation water shortage, so the magnitude of this risk can be rated high because the farms, we can imagine that, the farms, which is a farm engaged in cattle farming and cereal production, in this example, those sectors entirely relies on groundwater and surface water to run the activity. However, the likelihood of these risks in this case can be low because the farm is located in the region with regular rainfall and has a system in place to reduce the risk. So the overall risk is moderate. And the second one, so we still have high dependencies on the flood and storm protection ecosystem. So the risk of flood vulnerability, the magnitude of the risk is high. And if we look at the likelihood, in this example, the farms the farm is located in an area prone to flood, where land use changes have made the situation even worse, which make it a high priority risk. So yeah, these frameworks allow to rank the risks, to prioritize them. And of course, I will stop here, but the publication doesn't. It offers additional content beyond what has been covered today. It also includes a final section written by the World Benchmarking Alliance, which outlines the 4 key steps for integrating biodiversity into a corporate strategy, with concrete example and several recommendations.
Thanks a lot, Emma. So again, if you have any question, you can go on Menti. You have here the link and the code, and it's also in the chat. And we'll finish with a presentation by Lucille Blois, who will tell you a bit more about a specific training related to the sector we are developing.
Yes, so hi everyone. So as Claire said, my name is Lucille Blois and I work in the training team of CDC Biodiversité. And today I'm happy to introduce our new training module focusing on biodiversity challenging in the food and agriculture sector. So in this training, we'll explore the sector's main challenges, taking a deep dive in both its impact on biodiversity and its dependencies on natural ecosystems. So our key objectives for this module is to help participants understand and analyze the different ways the sector interacts with biodiversity, So to do that, we'll extract relevant insights and identify practical levers for action, giving you the knowledge and resources to drive meaningful change. This training is designed to be engaging and accessible, ensuring that all participants, whether it's in person or online as you wish, gain valuable knowledge. It's a short but impactful session as it lasts less than half a day. This can be flexible according to your needs and current level of information on this topic. And it's available in both French or English. And by the end of, not yet. Thank you. And by the end of this module, you'll be better prepared to raise awareness within your team and stakeholders, pursuing a more sustainable and biodiversity conscious approach in the food and agricultural sector. And now that we had an overview of the training, let's take a closer look at the program. So first, we'll set the stage by providing key context. So this includes important figures about the sector and defining the scope of our training and of the study. Then we'll dive into an in-depth exploration of the sector's impact and dependencies on biodiversity, where we'll walk you through our methodology and share and interpret the results. And next, we'll focus on both the regulatory and voluntary frameworks that guide biodiversity action in the sector, ensuring that you have a clear understanding of the compliance and best practices landscape. And finally, we'll identify practical actions and levers that you can implement within your operation, supply chain, and a broader stakeholder network. And to conclude very quickly, a key information is that all our training courses can be tailored to align with your own objectives and needs. So whether it's getting a more high-level overview or more actionable steps. So if you'd like more information on a customized approach, please feel free to reach out at the email address here. And that's it for the training.
Thanks a lot, Lucille. So we now have time for a few questions. So again, you have here the code to connect on Menti and raise your question. We already have one question for Blanche on the work she presented on the benchmark fact sheet related to the terrestrial static impact, and asking about the low score of fish products. Is there a bias in the methodology, as we know intensive fish capture have huge impact on marine biodiversity?
Yes, so thank you for the question. So in the presentation today, we decided to only focus on impacts on terrestrial biodiversity, but more results are available for impacts on aquatic biodiversity. But further than that, the GBS actually doesn't cover the impacts on marine biodiversity. It is a work that is the team is actually working on. But impacts on aquatic ecosystems are available in the two documents that you can read and have more information to the sector's impact on biodiversity.
Thank you, Blanche. So I'm checking, I don't see any other question. And I think we're reaching the end of the time we had for this webinar. So maybe I will go to the final slides. So thanks a lot for joining us. I just wanted to remind you about a few key services we can provide also to help you in your biodiversity journey. So you heard from Lucille about the specific training we have, but we also have another full range of offer of trainings if you want to better understand biodiversity footprint or use our global biodiversity score, which is our biodiversity footprinting tool. So you can get trained with us, and do not hesitate to reach out should you have any question. As you heard also during the webinar, so you can click, you can also join the B4B Plus Club if you want to exchange with other actors concerned by the same challenges you have when it comes to your biodiversity strategy and biodiversity footprint. So feel free to reach out also if you want to join our network. And last, we can also have a tailor-made support to help you understand your impacts and dependencies on biodiversity, help you align with regulations and standards, or also help you reduce your biodiversity footprint and set quantitative targets. So should you have any question on any of these services, we would be more than happy to discuss it with you. Do not hesitate to reach out to us. You have here the
the email address you can use if you want to have a chat with us. So we'll stop here and thank you very much for your participation today. We hope the sound problems we had did not prevent you from properly following our webinar. So thanks for joining and have a lovely day.